Good morning. My name is HaleyMustafa, and my 9 project's on the temporal trends of robberies in Brooklyn, New York for the year 2023. Beginning with my overview, I'll begin with some previous studies and how they look at temporal trends in relation to crime, as well as one study looked at strategic placement of patrol vehicles. I'll go over my introduction and how I looked at temporal trends in relation to robberies, my hypothesis, study area, results, conclusion, and then ultimately some of the recommendations I have once I had finished my study. Beginning with the previous studies, so like I said, I looked at 2 studies that focused on temporal trends and how they influence crime. These studies found that when people have more time on their hands, such as weekends, holidays, and days off from school, that they were more likely going to commit a crime. They also found that crime tends to peak around 7 p.m. as well as around midnight. And the other important study to my project was the strategic placement of patrol vehicles. And what this study found is that when law enforcement agencies better understand when and where a crime is more likely going to occur, they can be more efficient and effective, ultimately preventing crime before it happens. Here's my introduction. Like I said, I looked at Brooklyn, New York. I ultimately chose Brooklyn because it ranks in the 6th percentile of most dangerous places to live. And this means that 94% of the United States is much safer than Brooklyn, New York. And so I chose robberies to look at specifically because ultimately there was a national increase in robberies. Just in 2023 alone, there was a 2% increase in robberies. And so, to better understand when and where robbery is more likely going to occur, I decided to run a spatial analysis on robbery temporal trends. And what these temporal trends looked like, they were time of day, so morning, afternoon, and night. I looked at the day of the week, so weekdays versus weekends. And I also looked at the seasons winter, spring, summer, and fall. And from there, depending on the temporal trends that had passed, I decided to create maps to showcase the top 5 neighborhoods with the most robberies for that specific temporal trend. And then I compared them to the current most dangerous neighborhoods in Brooklyn, which are Brownsville, East New York, Bed-Stuy, Fort Greene, and Bushwick. And these are just based off crime in general. Moving on to my hypothesis. So I hypothesized that temporal trends ultimately play a role in influencing when and where a robbery will occur. Here is my study area. Like I said, I looked at Brooklyn, New York. It is one of the 5 New York City boroughs, and it is considered to be one of the more dangerous New York City boroughs next to Manhattan. It's also located in the southern portion of New York State. Here are my methods. Like I said, I decided to run spatial analysis models. I ran 2, one, the exploratory regression model, as well as the local bivariate relationship model. And I ultimately chose to run 2 models just because spatial analysis models can tend to be very biased depending on the certain parameters or spatial weights that you put in. And to try and avoid this altogether, I decided to run 2 and then ultimately compare the results from both of these models and to see if there were any major discrepancies between both of the models. From there, I decided to use Excel charts to create bar graphs to showcase the total robberies. So in Brooklyn, for the year 2023, there were 4,316 robberies total. So for each of the temporal trends, I showcased the total number of robberies. So you'll see for time of day, day of the week, and the season. And then from there, I decided to focus on the frequency in which robberies occur. So I looked at the individual days of the week, such as Monday through Sunday, as well as the individual months, January through December. And then lastly, from there, like I said, depending on which of the models had passed, I ultimately created maps to showcase the top 5 neighborhoods with the most robberies for each of the temporal trends that passed. Next, here's my model builder model. I have the exploratory regression and local bivariate relationship model. The top one is the exploratory regression, where I used a spatial weights matrix to run this. And then the bottom one is the local bivariate relationship, where I chose to run 199 permutations with 30 neighbors. And ultimately, I chose to run a lower number of permutations with a lower number of neighbors because had I had up the number of permutations, I would have ran the risk of creating a spatial relationship that may or may not have been there. And so just to sort of play it safe for my study, I ultimately chose a lower number of permutations with a lower number of neighbors. Moving on to my results, here is my exploratory regression model. And in order for the exploratory regression model to pass, it needs an adjusted R square value of 0.5 or higher. And as you can see here, all of my models had passed. They all got over 0.5 or higher. So to see which model is technically the best model, I looked at the AICC score to determine that. And so beginning with the time of day temporal trend, I'll look at nights, which got a just an R square value of 0.86 and an AICC score of 3,594.42. This was the best model for the time of day, and it was the second best model overall. Next, for the day of the week, we have weekdays versus weekends. Ultimately, weekdays had the highest adjusted R square value at 0.91, and it had the lowest AICC score at 3,252.76. And this was really interesting to see because this was not expected. I expected weekends to ultimately perform better. And also, weekdays had the best model overall. So that was really cool to see. And then lastly, for the seasons, the highest adjusted R square value was for the summer, it had 0.71, and it had the lowest AICC score at 4,180. Moving on, for the local bivariate relationship, the best one for time of day ultimately was the nighttime robberies. Out of 804 census tracts, there was 706 that had a positive linear relationship. So about 87% had a positive relationship between nights and robberies. And as you can see here, that majority of Brooklyn census tracts has a positive relationship between the two. Next, we have the day of the week, which ended up being weekdays again. It had the high, most out of 804 census tracts, 724 had a positive linear relationship between weekdays and robberies. And as you can see, that ended up being 90%. This was the best model overall again, which I thought was really cool to see. Also, when looking at the map, this was the only model out of all of the temporal trends to have some sort of spatial relationship between all of the census tracts. As you saw in nights, there was some that had not significant, but this was the only one that didn't have any that were not significant. So I thought that was pretty cool. Next, we have the local bivariate relationship of spring robberies. If you notice, summer had the better exploratory regression model. However, this was not the case for the local bivariate relationship model. Spring ultimately had a better. Summer had about 62% positive linear relationship between summer and robberies, while spring had a 66% relationship between spring and robberies. And obviously, this is not the best model, as you can see, just with all the not significance in there, but it was the best one for the season's temporal trend. Next, we have the total robberies based on the time of day temporal trend for Brooklyn, New York, 2023. And as you can see, nights had the most robberies at 2,192 robberies. This makes sense just looking at the previous studies when they said crime peaked around 7 p.m. as well as around midnight. So that was clear here, and then also had the best exploratory regression model as well as the best local bivariate relationship model. Then we have the total robberies based on the day of the week temporal trend in Brooklyn, New York for the year 2023. Weekdays had the most robberies at 3,029 robberies, while weekends only had about 1,087 robberies. This was interesting because, again, this was really not expected. I had expected to see weekends have more robberies than weekdays just based on that previous study. And then also, it's important to note that weekdays also had the better exploratory regression model as well as the local bivariate relationship model. So when looking at that, that kind of adds up here. And when looking at the individual days of the week, it was interesting. Mondays and Saturdays ultimately tied for the most robberies in 2023 with 660 robberies. I had expected when looking at the individual days of the week that Saturday or Sunday ultimately would have had the highest number of robberies. However, that was not the case. Moving on to the total robberies based on the season's temporal trend in Brooklyn, New York for the year 2023. Summers had the most robberies at 1,136 robberies, and it also had the best exploratory regression model, while spring, which only had about 1,064 robberies, had the better local bivariate relationship model. I would have expected spring to honestly have the second most robberies. However, that was not the case. And when looking at the individual months, ultimately there was not a month that really stood out. They were all within like the 300s and 400s. October had the most robberies at 414 robberies total, but this really wasn't by much because it was only about 15 robbery lead. So then lastly, I'll be comparing the original most dangerous neighborhoods, which was Brownsville, East New York, Bed-Stuy, Fort Greene, and Bushwick, to the top 5 neighborhoods with the most nighttime robberies, which ended up being Bushwick, Bed-Stuy, Bushwick again, Crown Heights, and East New York. So 3 out of the 5 original most dangerous neighborhoods showed up for the nighttime robberies. And as you can see here, they're all located in this northeastern region of Brooklyn. And pay attention to this because there tends to be a pattern. Then we have the top 5 neighborhoods with the most weekday robberies. We had East New York, Brownsville, Crown Heights, East New York again, and Bed-Stuy. Again, we're seeing 3 out of the 5 most dangerous neighborhoods show up. As you can see here, again, we're in this northeastern section of Brooklyn. And then for the spring robberies, the top 5 neighborhoods with the most spring robberies were Bed-Stuy, Crown Heights, East New York, Brownsville, and Bushwick. So 4 out of the 5 most dangerous neighborhoods showed up here. Again, we're still in the same area, northeastern side of Brooklyn. And then lastly, for the summer robberies, we have Dumbo, Bushwick, East New York, Bed-Stuy, Brownsville, East New York again, and Crown Heights. As you can see, Dumbo was more of an outlier, but we're still in this northern section of Brooklyn, which was kind of cool to see. And it's important to note that not just within these top temporal trends, this was seen throughout all of the temporal trends. They were all located in the same region of Brooklyn, which is really cool to see there was a pattern in where robberies are mainly occurring. Here is my conclusion. So ultimately, robberies are influenced by temporal trends. This was seen when all the temporal trends had passed. This didn't necessarily mean that all the temporal trends were great. However, they all showed that robberies tend to be influenced by them. And ultimately, the best model ended up being the weekday robberies. It had the highest performing model overall for both the exploratory regression as well as the local bivariate relationship model. This really was not expected. I had expected to see maybe the night's temporal trend because of peaks around 7 p.m. and midnight, or even the weekends temporal trend. I was not expecting for weekdays to ultimately have the highest performing model overall. And then when looking at those individual days of the week, Mondays and Saturdays had the most robberies in the year 2023. Again, this really was not expected. I had expected to see Saturday or Sunday ultimately have the most robberies for the year 2023. However, this was not the case. It's really interesting, though, that Monday would be able to tie with Saturday. Then lastly, East New York was considered the most dangerous neighborhood for robberies specifically because it ultimately had the most robberies in the year 2023. And that was not just within the top temporal trends that you saw. It was also throughout all the temporal trends in general. East New York showed up multiple times throughout. And then lastly, here are some recommendations that I had once I had finished my project. So looking at the patrol car placement, I would keep the original 4 out of the 5 most dangerous neighborhoods based on crime, which was Brownsville, East New York, Bed-Stuy, and Bushwick. However, I would remove Fort Greene because Fort Greene didn't show up one time. I know you just saw the top models, but even in the regular temporal trends that didn't perform as well, Fort Greene didn't show up in either of them. So I thought that was interesting. I would have expected to see it come up in at least 1 or 2. However, that just was not the case. So instead, I would put Crown Heights because Crown Heights showed up multiple times and throughout all, if not all, almost all, the temporal trends. And then lastly, my recommendations, just to kind of further the research, would to work on creating a spatial analysis for the individual days of the week, really focusing on this Monday and Saturday because they had the most robberies in 2023, and then kind of determine from there what time the robberies occur. So focusing on the time of day, such as morning, afternoon, and night for these high priority days, and then from there do the patrol car placement based on the times that shown up the most. And then here are my sources. Thank you.